Greetings, adventurers. Welcome to Miniature Legends, a place where even the smallest of figures can be legendary. Today, you find me at the start of a rather ambitious project. I am beginning work on a diorama for the Squidmar Open Painting Contest. The problem is, I only have 22 days left to submit. So, what am I planning? Well, a few years ago, I was given these lovely knight miniatures as a gift. At the time, I wasn't sure what my plans for them would be, but now I have an idea. I want to paint them up in an epic fantasy diorama, showcasing them in the middle of a dramatic joust. Well, no time like the present. Let's get started, shall we? I began by cleaning and assembling the models. Overall, the print quality was good, but I did find that the fittings on this model, Dame Teuta, were a bit too tight, so I mixed up some green stuff epoxy putty to replace the fittings and fill the gaps with the model. I wasn't too worried about the slight spillover, as I figured it would just be painted to look like cloth protruding from the armor. I also used the green stuff to repair an issue with Sir Keane's miniature, as the sculpt has protrusion from the armor sticking through the cloak. Next, I got to work assembling the base for my diorama. Printing out this fencing in FDM, I removed the skirting from the print, cutting these posts free, as I felt they would be distracting from the piece. I sanded the fence using my Dremel, as I felt the lines would be a bit too noticeable, using the plastic bag to catch the majority of the dust as I worked. Then, I glued the fence symmetrically to the base, and gave it a coat of Mod Podge. Mod Podge, being resin-based, acts as a sealant here, to prevent warping from water-based paints later in the process. I rolled out some air-dry clay, gave it a coat of PVA glue and sand, shook off the excess, and sealed it in place with a mix of Mod Podge and black acrylic paint. And we were ready to get priming. Using my airbrush, I applied a thin coat of black primer across both the knights and the base. I decided against my usual zenithal highlight for the miniatures, as I want to make sure I build more controlled color across the piece. But I did apply one to the base, as well as a light coat of brown ink, something that I found was a bit unnecessary later. I got to work establishing the base coats on Sir Keane here. I recently got some heavy body acrylics, and I thought this would be a wonderful space to experiment with these new paints. I found myself inspired by the aesthetics of Warcraft while painting these minis, mostly from the somewhat oversized shields and pauldrons. So, I leaned into it by drawing color inspiration from the Stormwind Guard, namely, the blue and gold color scheme paired with the lion motif. I often paint with references, and I found myself drawn to medieval illuminated manuscripts for the inspiration for this project, namely the bright and colorful regalia the knights would wear when jousting. I spent a lot of time trying to understand the color and tone of the helm. It was going to be a focal point, so I focused on understanding how the light would fall across this curved reflective surface in a way that would be interesting and read strongly as metal, building layers and glazing as needed. Once I had a solid understanding of the light and color of the armor, I got to work replicating that method across the piece. I felt that the warm off-white was a good tertiary color, so I began painting the horse a warm beige, layering that towards off-white. For the lance, I felt it was quite barren, so I decided to paint a simple freehand pattern to give it a bit more visual interest, using the blue and yellow heraldry of the knight. Doing my best to pick out details and add edge highlights across the piece. While I was making good progress on Sir Keane here, I was beginning to realize that I was at the halfway point and I had not progressed with the second knight or the base, so I switched focus and got to work on Dame Teuta. In the interest of saving time, I decided I would give the entire miniature a coat of dark red using my airbrush. I figured that red would contrast very well with the blue of the Sir Keane miniature once the piece was assembled. Then, I got to work blocking in the base coats, starting with the dark grey of Dame Teuta's horse. The armor was a bit of a challenge here. I felt that it didn't quite match the look of plate mail from the sculpting work, so after some considerations, I decided upon painting it as more of a fantasy brigandine armor, with a red and gold color scheme. I blocked in a simple checkerboard pattern onto the horse's skirt with black. For the shield, I decided upon a simple but eye-catching red and white paint scheme. I began building layers of color across the piece, using the same non-metallic metal gold recipe that I used when painting Sir Keane. Liking the look of the shield, I painted a couple coats of warm tan onto the black checkerboard sections. I felt it had better composition and didn't blend in with the horse's black coat. I wanted to add some eye-catching detail here, so I began painting a pair of green gemstones into the pauldrons, glazing and layering it to match the light cast from above. I was beginning to get nervous on how little time remained for this project. I began to put longer and longer painting sessions in to get more work accomplished, picking out details, highlighting and glazing to push the piece towards a more finished state. I was very unhappy with her hair. It didn't feel like it was working, so I used a thin contrast paint glaze to shift it towards a dark brown. At this point, I was clearly running out of time. I needed to finish this project as soon as possible. I jumped into painting the base, establishing a dark brown base coat for the earth, and a warm brown for the fence. In the interest of saving more time, I coated the fence with a thinned contrast glaze to establish my shadows and add a more wood-like tone. Then, I got to work dry brushing a mid-tone brown, trying to pick out some textures from the sand and clay. Once that was finished, I super glued and held the knights in place while they dried. I needed to add some texture and color variation, so I grabbed a selection of tufts from my local hobby store and got to work gluing them in irregular patterns. Making sure to leave a clear path where the horses would have tread. I added some highlights to the wood, trying to make it seem a bit aged and sun-bleached. Then, I added a few final details and glazes to the miniatures in the limited time that I had remaining. As a final touch, I blended and intensified the shadows with some dark inks through my airbrush. A final coat of matte finish, and I was ready to call it complete with 2 hours to spare. That gave me time to get some good photographs and get it submitted online. I'm thrilled to get that done in just 22 days. I should know the results sometime around the first week of March, so if you're interested in hearing about it, please feel free to subscribe, and I'll make a follow-up on how I did. Oh, and while you're here, you can help me out by giving an interaction to the YouTube imp, or by sharing this video with a friend. It really helps. Now, in homage of Squidmar, time for a grand reveal. Thank you so much for watching. Did you also submit miniatures for this contest? I'd love to hear what you lovely adventurers have been painting, whether it's for the contest or not. For now, if you want to see more of my work on miniatures, why not click on the video on the top left? I hope to see you again soon. Farewell, adventurers.